Hello, and thank you for joining us. I'm Amy Pendergrass with Moss Adams, and I'm going to get us started for today's session, The Future of Reimbursement Through the Lens of MedPAC, which is part of the virtual portion of our 2022 Healthcare Conference. Before we begin, I'm going to play a brief video.
Welcome, and thanks for joining. We're pleased to present our continuing professional education webcast series. Before we begin, please keep the following in mind. You can customize how you view our presentation and interact with the presenter. For better viewing, close all other applications and turn up your speaker volume. You can adjust window size and placement or enter full screen mode using the controls at the top right of the window or dragging the bottom right-hand corner to resize. At the bottom of your screen, you'll see a series of icons that relate to a different aspect of our session. You can download a PDF of today's slides from the Slide Deck and Handouts widget. You can ask questions by typing in the Q&A window and clicking Submit. We'll do our best to answer all questions or follow up via email. If you experience technical difficulty, refresh your browser by hitting the F5 key. Today's session offers 1.5 CPE credits. To receive credit, you must meet the National Association of State Boards of Accountancy requirements. You must attend at least 75 minutes of the session and respond to at least 75% of polling questions. To participate in the polls, please check the button next to your answer within the slide window and click Submit. We'll track your progress and alert you when you've earned CPE credit. You can then click the certificate icon in the CPE Progress widget and download your CPE certificate. Don't worry if you can't download your CPE certificate today. We'll email you a copy in 2 weeks. If attending this webcast in a group, you must complete our group CPE attendance sheet, available in our Slide Deck and Handouts widget to receive credit. Please have all group members sign it and send only one sheet per group. CPE credit can only be awarded to participants registered as themselves and isn't available for participants who view the on-demand version. This presentation is not legal, investment, or accounting advice. We encourage you to seek the counsel of a professional service provider to apply this content to your specific circumstances.
All right, and now that we have our housekeeping video out of the way, I'm going to hand it over to Brian Connor, partner and healthcare consulting group leader here at Moss Adams. Brian, the floor is yours.
Perfect. Amy, thank you for the introduction. Appreciate that. And welcome everyone to the virtual conclusion of our 2022 annual healthcare conference, which we began in person, in early November in Las Vegas. And what a couple of days that was. That was really some great sessions there. And I'm joined here before we get started today in our session here this afternoon or this morning, depending on where you are, by Eric Klein, who's the healthcare practice leader with Shepard Mullen, who's a co-presenting sponsor for us for the annual healthcare conference, as well as Susan Denser, who's the president and CEO of America's Physician Groups, who both feature very prominently in our Las Vegas sessions. When we went to structure this conference, what we had wanted to do, or what we decided to do, was to kind of set up, table set the healthcare State of the Union in early sessions, and then attempt to follow that with panel sessions, sharing opportunities and options related to challenges outlined from those closest to the action. And I think we ended up succeeding in doing that, had some great sessions throughout our time in Las Vegas. But I think when you start the table setting with a French Revolution and Napoleon metaphor, you're in deep water early. And that was certainly the case with our early sessions, kind of outlining some of the significant and acute challenges that are facing the healthcare industry. Certainly some themes that were pulled out from that are workforce in crisis and significant crisis, some substantial macroeconomic headwinds that we have that we're facing in the healthcare industry. And of course, amidst those operational challenges, the healthcare industry is continuing to deal with deteriorating health outcomes, both physical and mental, and of course, the ongoing pandemic. A uniquely challenging environment. And in addition to that, Eric, I know, what's caught your attention, is the continuing regulatory layering that we're seeing on top of these operating challenges. And we had a discussion in the morning session on our first day in Las Vegas about California Senate Bill 184, is that adding to the various state efforts for Office of Healthcare Affordability initiatives. And I know that's something that you've been watching closely and just adds to, a lot of the challenges that we potentially have here in the healthcare industry.
That's exactly right, Brian. And thank you also for the wonderful conference. Moss Adams always does a great job with that. And, Senate Bill 184 in California is a very good example of a way that folks can go to firms like Moss Adams for advice, or to law firms or other consulting firms. But, what we see with that new bill that passed this summer as part of a budget trailer bill, and therefore was very quietly adopted, is what we're seeing in about 10 states nationally. And Massachusetts has had this for a while, but in the past year or so, we've seen Oregon, we've also seen California adopt bills. What these do are really two things, one of which is it imposes cost controls. And so, for example, in California, starting in 2025, the state will be collecting data and applying cost trend targets to all healthcare sectors. And so far, we think it really does mean all healthcare sectors. Regulations are being drafted now, will be posted for comment within the next year. But if you exceed those cost targets, then your company, unless it is exempt or obtains a waiver, it will have to go through corrective action. And the statute itself actually calls for financial penalties if you continue to violate those cost trend targets and do not successfully complete corrective action. That exposure can be up to the full amount of revenue that you received above those cost trend target numbers. So it's very draconian in that sense. We also see the other piece, which is a new layer of transaction scrutiny and an opportunity for the regulators to put their thumb on the scale and to decide in what direction are the state's healthcare efforts going to go. So, for example, starting in April 2024, we will see the state of California, through this new OCA agency, Office of Healthcare Affordability, we will see them reviewing transactions for any antitrust effect, but also any effect on healthcare costs and for impact on access and underserved community participation in care. Very similar in Oregon right now. That statute was put in place earlier than the California statute, has a little bit greater powers, actually. It can actually step in and stop transactions. But that is subject right now to litigation. The Oregon Hospital Association is suing the Oregon Health Authority because they believe that the statute is overbroad and vague. It's going to be really interesting because it has the potential here to substantially change the landscape if you control what are best practices, if you put in place, as the California bill does, requirements to maintain workforce stability, but at the same time you're supposed to cut costs. Really hard to do. And given the trend towards consolidation right now, we're going to see a lot of change going on in the industry as the industry reevaluates the impact of these new merger control laws in not only California and Oregon, but in the up to 10 other states that are currently considering this. So it's something to watch. A lot of folks don't know about this yet. I keep getting every single week people say, oh my God, really? I had no idea. And so as a result, talk to Moss Adams, talk to us or other folks that know what's going on here, because it is indeed going to change at a state level the face of the healthcare industry. Brian?
Yeah, thanks, Eric. And again, the challenges that we're dealing with financially, operationally, from a regulatory perspective, significant out there. And Susan, I know, financially and operationally, the challenges identified, and really the magnitude of those challenges really caught your attention. The workforce crisis and financial stability in particular, really a unique operating environment for our healthcare providers and other entities.
It truly is, Brian. And to pick up on the points you made, this combination, this almost perfect storm. Of course, we think we've been in a perfect storm for several years now, but the new dimensions of the perfect storm are, as you said, we're still in the pandemic. We expect a very severe flu, RSV, COVID season. So huge operational pressures on the health system coming just from that, at a time when there are enormous workforce challenges. Certainly every one of our members at APG is desperate to try to hire people, particularly mental health providers who are in extremely short supply, as well as others, nurses, primary care physicians. So seeing a lot of wage growth, a lot of cost pressures coming from that. Surprisingly, in many instances, not the sort of rushing back to healthcare that might have been expected this year. It does look as if the numbers, in many respects, of people accessing healthcare still lagged somewhat, notwithstanding the fact that at least for a good part of the year, it seemed as if we were emerging from the pandemic. So the cost pressure is high, the revenue pressure is intense, and I'll be talking shortly with Mike Chernew about what we expect further on the reimbursement front. And let's just say it's not going to bail anybody in healthcare out of any of these problems anytime soon. So a real squeeze coming. And as Eric said, when you layer that against some of the explicit moves in various states to rein in expenditure growth in healthcare over time, it is going to force a lot of change onto the sector. There's no question about it.
Yeah, agree. No question about it. We did have, as I mentioned, lots of sessions, which both Eric and Susan were involved in later in the afternoon, talking about, as I mentioned, options, opportunities from those closest to the action. What are we doing on the ground to try and find solutions to these significant challenges and issues? One of the themes that came up, Eric, quite often was the continued, I don't know if it's race or jog or stagger towards value-based care, but there's continuing inertia and movement in that direction. We had a great session on Medicare Advantage, a session in the afternoon of the first day on mental and behavioral health and how that is being incorporated into some value-based care components. Value-based care clearly is still an option and opportunity for organizations that are dealing with these many challenges that we're talking about.
That's really true, Brian. And if we look at what's happening with value-based and risk-based care, we're continuing to see very strong growth in those areas. Specifically, for example, we're seeing very strong growth in Medicare Advantage right now, as well as strong participation in the ACO REACH program, which was launched by CMS as a follow-on to direct contracting. We've done tens and tens and tens of applications for that for our clients. And we're going to see interesting play where that basically takes Medicare fee-for-service beneficiaries and wraps around them the care coordination and the global risk win-win alignment of economics. And so it'll be interesting to see what the numbers come back and look like there. When we think about this, there's a number of, interesting critical viewpoints that have been raised this year on Medicare Advantage, a number of which were aired at our conference, such as the problems with risk adjustment and questions about overall cost. But that being said, we're not really seeing large-scale change being proposed for the Medicare Advantage program because value and risk are really seen as the only ways right now to bend the cost curve. When we look at Ford Coles of the advisory board, who gave a fascinating presentation at the conference, he noted that Medicare enrollment really has continued to grow quite rapidly. And if we look at new enrollment, for example, over half of new enrollment for this next year is expected to be into Medicare Advantage rather than to traditional fee-for-service Medicare. There's also quite a bit of consolidation in the Medicare Advantage industry, where what we're seeing is that United, for example, grew by almost 1 million members from January 2021 to January 2022. Obviously, we're in open enrollment period right now, or annual enrollment period right now, so we don't know what the numbers are going to look like until we get there. but the others have also grown as well. United's about twice as big as everybody else other than Humana. It's about a third larger in terms of Medicare enrollment than Humana. And many of those insurance companies are setting up their own ecosystems right now. Optum, which is owned by United, has over 60,000 physicians in its organization, the largest out there, larger than HCA, larger than Kaiser. Humana has put a lot of time and attention into growing its CenterWell physician organization. And CVS Aetna recently announced with Signify, the $8 billion acquisition, that they're going to be moving into the provider space. And that's in the face of continuing growth of physician practice acquisitions and the growth of super practice groups, as Ford was saying, folks like Village MD and Summit Health, which are coming together. We are leading that transaction for Village MD, Oak Street, Optum, ChenMed, Privia, and many others. So we're seeing a lot of growth there, especially in competition to the insurance company ecosystems that we're seeing. And what that consolidation does is it makes it easier, because of scale, to move towards the type of infrastructure and technology that you need to do value and risk well. Now, one of the most fascinating things that Ford shared with us was even in something like Medicare Advantage, which is supposed to be risk-based, there's huge opportunities there for change and for improvement, because as it turns out, very little of the Medicare Advantage contracts out there are actually paying the providers on a capitated or population health management risk basis. If we look at his numbers here, he was saying that only 22% of Medicare Advantage payments are being made on a capitated or population health management basis. The remainder, 36%, is in value-based care payments, and 42% is still in fee-for-service. So huge opportunities there to really change things. Same thing is true in commercial risk. We're really seeing commercial risk being very small, and in some states like California is decreasing in size. But there's some interesting things going on out there. What Vera Whole Health is doing with JP Morgan, Village MD is doing, Cigna's doing. And we're also expecting to see, instead of commercial risk only, we're also expecting to see some emphasis on high-spend episodic models. How do you deal with things like cancer? How do you deal with things like orthopedics issues, where they are episodic and they are very high cost? So we're going to see costs continue to rise because of the aging of the population, the increasing cost of labor, huge amount of new pharma drugs in the pipeline. And then mental health is a big issue. We've all seen the newspaper stories. Everybody knows people are impacted. We haven't figured out what to do with mental health yet. And the costs of that are going to be very significant. If you look at ER visits, a very large number of them are mental health related, and that's a real burden on the system. So overall, the pressure there is going to be to focus on value and risk. Thank you, Brian.
Yeah, thanks, Eric. Appreciate it. And, as we talk about the various challenges that we're seeing and options and opportunities, and we think about our conference, all of our pre-polling and post-conference polling in prior years, when we asked the audience, what do you want to see and what's important to you and what do you want to hear about? The future of reimbursement is always top of the list, one of the top two, critical issue for our audience. So we're happy to start the conclusion of our the virtual conclusion of our conference here with the discussion on the future of reimbursement, again with Susan Dentzer, CEO, President of America's Physician Groups, leading a discussion with Michael Chernew, who's the chair of the Medicare Payment Advisory Commission, MedPAC. So before we get to that conversation, and I know you're all eagerly waiting, we're going to do some polling questions here to get started quickly and make sure that all of our audience gets the CP that they're looking for. So the first one is, which best describes your organization? You can see the answers here, the radio buttons to the left: hospital, integrated health system, physician, medical group, IPA. So please click the button that best describes your organization, and then make sure you hit submit at the bottom, and that will give you credit for the CPE questions. And if you can't see the submit button, widen your slide screen, and you should see that at the bottom. And I'll wait just a little bit longer. Make sure we give our audience a few moments to get their CPE in, and we'll take a look at the results. We're going to go through 3 quick polling questions here before I hand it over to Susan to get started. So just a couple more moments. And let's take a look at the results. And as is usually the case, and what we like about our conferences, we got a pretty good spectrum of representation here. Some concentration in hospitals and health systems, but as always, we love to see the spectrum of providers joining our conference here. Our second polling question, in 2022, how is your organization performing financially? You see the answers here in the radio buttons to the left. Doing well, seeing positive margins, just about break even, experiencing moderate losses, or experiencing large financial losses. I just want to remind everybody as we go through our presentation here today with Susan and Michael that we do have a Q&A feature. So you can submit questions for the presenters in the Q&A window. We will monitor that, and to the extent that we have the ability at the end to answer those questions, we will do so. And if we can't get to those during the presentation, we'll make a concerted effort to follow up with you after the presentation. But please, we encourage you to use that Q&A feature. And surprisingly, Susan, we have a good amount of the group doing well, seeing positive margins. That's excellent to see, especially considering the environment that we had discussed coming out of our November in-person session, but also a significant percentage of the group that's also experiencing moderate to large financial losses. And let's go to our final polling question here. Final polling question of the first round. There will be three additional polling questions at the end so you can qualify for your CPE. What percentage of revenue is derived from government reimbursement, Medicare, Medicaid, or other state and local funding? And again, as a reminder, click the radio button on your left, hit submit, and in order to get CPE credit, you will need to answer 5 of the 6 questions that we'll have, 3 here at the beginning and 3 towards the end of the presentation. So make sure you do that. As you can see, there are no correct answers. You're not going to get graded. You just need to send in a response. And we'll make just a moment more. And let's take a look at the results here. So a plurality of those that are more than 50% government reimbursement, Susan, certainly sets the stage for your conversation here today with Michael. I'm sure they're all interested in the future of reimbursement.
Yes, indeed, they are, Brian. And all the better reason to bring on now Mike Chernew, as you said. Mike is a distinguished economist from the Harvard Medical School, also currently serving as chair of MedPAC. This is his second tour of duty at MedPAC. Mike, welcome. It's terrific to have you joining us today.
Susan, it is great to be here. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, we can. Thanks so much.
So I'm thrilled to be here. I will emphasize I'm going to be speaking largely in my capacity as a professor at Harvard, not in my role as MedPAC chair, although obviously I may say something specifically about MedPAC if asked. But in any case, it is always wonderful to chat with you, and I'm thrilled to be here for this audience.
Well, thanks. And we'll just note you are the same person, whether you're the Harvard economist or the chair of MedPAC. So, but you'll distinguish for us when you're speaking from one perspective or another. So, well, Mike, as we heard, and just now the polling showed a lot of the audience today is more than 50% dependent on government funding, government reimbursement, which leads us directly to the topic of Medicare. As long as I've known you, you've been talking about the unsustainable rate of growth of U.S. healthcare spending and projecting forward that at some point in the distant future, if the rates of growth continued, healthcare would constitute the entirety of the GDP. Where do we stand now in the big picture perspective on the rate of growth of Medicare, and what is driving the Medicare spending growth at this point in time?
So everything you said is correct. I think the challenges we face in the healthcare sector, particularly in the public programs, are as much fiscal as they are clinical, and they dovetail with a series of other broad macroeconomic questions like taxation and debt policy, which I'm not going to talk about much. Medicare continues to be projected to grow faster than national income. That is largely due to two factors. The first is the demographics that we face in this country. So there is a core issue, which is as the baby boomers move on to the Medicare program, we have more Medicare beneficiaries per worker, and that creates a fiscal challenge the way the program is financed. And then there's an assumption in the projections going forward that volume per person, that's volume and intensity per Medicare beneficiary, will continue to rise through some combination of new technologies, things like new drugs, for example, would be the poster child for that, but also just more use of other services, what generally fits into volume and intensity. Interestingly, in the commercial sector, what gets a lot of attention is price. There's well-known academic papers with titles like "It's the Price is Stupid," things like that. In Medicare, that is simply not the case. Forecasted Medicare price increases under current law are below what we would expect inflation to be for a range of reasons I'm happy to discuss. So while the commercial sector is focused on prices, in the Medicare sector, there's some combination of demographics and volume and intensity increases that are really the drivers of projected spending growth.
And I guess one question we could put on the table is how much longer would prices be expected to drive that commercial spending? Or are we at a juncture where, as I've often said, it looks like the dominant model of U.S. healthcare is to price itself out of the affordability of almost everybody. At what point does commercial spending wake up to that reality and not pass all of this along in terms of prices?
The at what point question is just so challenging because it's not going to be like we wake up one morning and all of a sudden there's going to be a change. I think the discussion that was, Brian was just having with Eric leads to an understanding that across the country, there's a range of activities where policymakers are now trying to get a handle on aspects of commercial prices. You mentioned the initiatives in California. We certainly have targets here in Massachusetts. There's stuff going on in Delaware. There's work going on in Oregon. There's work going on in Vermont. Just don't mean to leave any state out, but there's a lot of state level activities on commercial prices. They range from things that loosely fit into sort of targets. In Massachusetts, we have a system of sort of targets, hope, and shame, or some version of that, where we have targets and we have performance improvement plans for people that don't meet them. In California, I think there's a little bit more teeth into the regulatory structure for what they're doing. So I don't think it's going to be a sort of on and off tipping point where all of a sudden over the cliff. I think it's going to be a steady degradation in the ability of organizations to charge ever more in the commercial market, either because of regulatory changes or because of actions on the commercial side. Narrowing networks would be a typical example, where if you are charging a lot, you're going to get cut out of networks in some markets. So some combination of sort of, or people will have to pay out of pocket, and oftentimes they can't afford to. There's a lot of unpaid debt. So there's sort of private commercial responses to high prices, which is inevitable as premiums rise. And then there's regulatory responses to the outcry of high prices and, more importantly, high premiums in the commercial sector. And so we're slowly getting to a point where it's going to be increasingly hard to live off of commercial price increases.
Well, from putting that together, what we could conclude then is there are going to be reimbursement pressures, payment pressures, if you will, all around, very, very dramatically in the public program side and increasingly so on the commercial side. Is that a fair assessment?
Yes. I should have been that concise when you asked me.
Well, we got there. Okay, that being the case, what I guess we can really ask, the pressure then is going to be on the healthcare sector to reorganize itself in some way that it can live within this straightened level of reimbursement. As you said, very strong pressures on reimbursement on the public program side, no cavalry, as you said, coming to the rescue on the commercial side. So as we think about the ability of the healthcare sector to reorganize itself, as we know, and as Eric pointed out, some increasing regulatory oversight there as well. Concerns that, yes, indeed, reimbursement pressures are pronounced, but that doesn't mean that some organizations aren't going to try to get an advantage by consolidating, by exerting greater price bargaining power in the marketplace. So how do you see that set of forces playing out if indeed we're really going to have to be forcing the healthcare sector to reorganize itself?
Yeah, so a few things. I don't want to give you the impression that the revenue going into the healthcare sector, the spending into the healthcare sector is actually going to drop. You know, even the Medicare forecast, spending is going to rise. There will be more revenue in the system going forward than there is now. The rate of growth of that revenue will largely be slowed. And there will always be organizations that will have various strategies related to consolidation that gives them market power vis-a-vis insurers, for example. This has been going on for a long time and continues now, that type of consolidation. So we'll continue to see that type of market power type of mergers. In some cases, the mergers may offer the possibility to have efficiencies, although in the past, those efficiencies haven't necessarily been realized. And so I think what really is on the table, and I'm going to interpret your notion of reorganizing itself as the policymakers on the public side and hopefully the stakeholders on the private side will try and create incentive systems that allow organizations that can efficiently deliver high quality of care to succeed. The traditional American healthcare system was built on a business model in which success required you to do more services and more profitable services, more specialized services, all of which, on average, I think clearly improved the health of Americans. So I'm not disputing that on average. At the margin, I think there was also a lot of low-value care delivered in that setting. And as we begin to think about reforms to the American healthcare system, be they be in the commercial or in the private sectors, we're trying to develop models that encourage more efficient production of care. And those models differ across public and private, even within public. So it's not simply a question of lowering prices. In fact, as a general point, I think the American healthcare system would be ill-served by a world that stayed exactly the same way it was now, and we just slashed the prices. I think we need to think about payment models and delivery models and financing models, more broadly, say Medicare Advantage, that enable the efficient delivery of care as opposed to just doing the same thing for less.
Which gets us to the topic of value-based care, obviously, and the increasing set of incentives that are being shaped through both on the public side by CMS and by the Center for Medicare and Medicaid Innovation, and somewhat more slowly on the commercial side. What is your assessment of the degree to which we've seen success in these various alternative payment models to date?
Well, I'll start with the public side, and I think the evidence is both clear, positive, and disappointing in some level. So I think it's pretty clear that at least in the broadest type of models, population-based payment models, think ACOs, that they have enabled behavior change that has produced care more efficiently. All of which is good. The rub, if you will, is that the savings are a relatively small percentage point. So 3%, 2%, 5% in a range of ways. It hasn't certainly revolutionized spending in the fee-for-service system. there's been a number of design issues in those programs. We can talk about what some of them are and ways that they might change. So the question at some level in the Medicare program I'll speak to specifically is, on one hand, you have new payment models and fee-for-service, which enable efficiency but have a number of design parameter issues that the CMS and CMMI are working on, and I actually think they're moving in the right direction. The speed with which they're moving in that direction, remains to be seen, but I think they're, broadly speaking, moving in the right direction. You mentioned REACH, or someone mentioned REACH earlier, and I think there's been reforms to the MSSP program I think are good. I think the basic roadmap for success that's been laid out by CMMI, I think, is broadly a step in the right direction. So that's sort of one strand of activity. The other strand of activity is in Medicare Advantage, and as noted, I think roughly half of eligible Medicare beneficiaries now are in Medicare Advantage. And Medicare Advantage has some similarities to these value-based payment models. They accept from Medicare a population-based payment, but there's a lot of important differences. They're working through the insurance sector, not sort of directly through providers. They're able to increase the benefits to Medicare beneficiaries, the generosity, which the ACOs have a much harder time doing in a much more limited scale. And so there's this tension between the growth of the Medicare Advantage program, which has certain strengths and weaknesses, and the ability to transform what's happening in fee-for-service payment. And we're just going to have to see how that plays out over the next several years. But I do think it's really important for providers writ large to engage in these types of systems, because I think the alternative strategy, consolidate, charge higher prices, particularly in the commercial market, that is a strategy which I think is probably going to be a more short-sighted strategy relative to really transforming the way care is delivered.
So earlier you heard Eric cite some data that we heard about at the conference in Las Vegas about the degree to which Medicare Advantage really is taking full advantage, you'll forgive the pun, of true value-based payment, in the sense that most of providers, generally speaking, in Medicare Advantage are still being paid on a fee-for-service basis. There's some of them are our members at APG, who are in delegated relationships with health plan, where the responsibility and the risk is delegated over to them. But that really is the minority of providers participating in the MA program. Is that, in your view, an inherent limit to the degree to which we will really get value out of Medicare Advantage?
I am less dogmatic about the structure of the relationship between, say, a Medicare Advantage plan and the underlying providers that deliver care. The value, of course, of the American healthcare system is in care delivery. So at the end of the day, what's important is the care that patients get at the bedside to improve their health. The delivery system can address that in a number of ways. There are aspects you see in parts of REACH and certainly in Medicare Advantage and some plans where they really delegate that risk down to the provider level. They're essentially building ACOs within the MA program, or even commercially, they're building ACOs where that risk is going down to the delivery system. And I think that's a reasonable approach, but I wouldn't argue that that approach is right for every context. I think there's other models in which you could have the MA plan partnering with provider groups, doing certain aspects of utilization management and other things that have novel payment models underneath. And I think a lot of the MA plans do have novel payment models. So I don't think it's really an either or. In fact, I think one of the great strengths of the MA program or the commercial market at large is the payers can work in ways that are contextually appropriate for where they are, and the providers can engage with the payers in ways that are contextually appropriate. So what's working in Massachusetts doesn't have to be the same thing that's working in Texas one way or another. And I think that flexibility is ultimately important. I should note that even within ACOs, even within an ACO structure, now you have a value-based payment, there's a lot of underlying fee-for-service that goes on. And even in big delivery systems where the delivery system itself is taking, say, a capitated payment one way or another, they often have productivity incentives down at the provider level that turn out to function in some ways like fee-for-service. And the appropriate way in which the money flows from, say, the Medicare program to the delivery system, or the plan to the delivery system, to the actual physicians and hospitals and advanced practice nurses and all of the other people in the healthcare space. All of those layers have underlying incentives and informational challenges that I think are best developed, that in ways that work in that context. So I don't think that fee-for-service inherently is problematic. I think what matters is the structures, managerially or otherwise, that you build around that so you can try and get to the outcomes that we want.
As the saying goes, there's no such thing as a completely benign incentive nor a completely non-benign incentive. And fee-for-service, it does in some respects have its virtue. If you want to get care to people, that's one way to do it, is incentivize the providers to deliver it. Let's stay on Medicare Advantage for a moment, and wearing your MedPAC hat. MedPAC, in fact, has recommended a 2 percentage point cut in payments to Medicare Advantage plans. Some of this, of course, seeming to arise from the fact that looking at the biggest picture, Medicare Advantage plans do seem to be costing more overall than the traditional Medicare program. Leaving aside for the notion whether traditional Medicare is or is not the appropriate baseline to judge MA plans against, it is currently serving that purpose. What, from the MedPAC perspective, what is the argument for cutting MA plans by 2 percentage points?
Yeah, so this is a complex answer. I will try and be concise. So first, let me say a few things that I believe to be true. I actually think MedPAC also believes this to be true. Medicare Advantage plans can deliver care more efficiently than fee-for-service. And I think there's a fair bit of evidence that that's true. We could debate the magnitude of that efficiency, but I think it's clear that they can deliver care more efficiently than the fee-for-service system for a range of reasons. Medicare Advantage plans, despite that efficiency in care delivery, are also paid more than fee-for-service, as you mentioned, and that higher payment stems from a number of factors. Part of it stems from pure policy decisions. So in the Medicare Advantage program, a quarter of the markets are paid 115% of fee-for-service on purpose. Another quarter, 107%. Another quarter paid at parity. Ignoring the measurement issues, the policy explicitly is to pay more than fee-for-service. On top of that, the quality bonus program, the STARS program, explicitly pays above fee-for-service for plans that are performing well. And again, one could debate the merits of whether you're getting better quality if you do better performance on the STAR system, but the bottom line is the structure for intentional policy purposes has been to pay Medicare Advantage more than fee-for-service in many, many instances. The last quartile, they do indeed pay less. The other reason why Medicare Advantage is paid more, which gets the lion's share of the attention, is how risk adjustment is done and how coding works. And the coding debate is complex because people often assume if Medicare Advantage codes more completely than the fee-for-service system, that's inherently fraudulent, which is not true. The fee-for-service system itself is incomplete in its coding. And so Medicare, it is not unreasonable to say that Medicare Advantage codes more completely and more accurately. And so it's a calibration issue, although it is also probably true, and there's been some specific cases where Medicare Advantage plans, and again, they're not all the same, have been perhaps more aggressive than would be intended. So that's why there's a gap between fee-for-service and Medicare Advantage. It is part policy, it is part Medicare Advantage efficiencies, and it's part this sort of coding effect that has been hard to get handled. The MedPAC recommendation, and I'll be a little more precise, is that Medicare Advantage payments benchmarks be cut at least 2%, so it opens the door for more potentially. And the argument is largely based on a general belief that the Medicare Advantage plan's efficiencies should be shared to some extent with the program. So if you can produce high quality care for less, the program should benefit in some of those efficiencies. And in part because of a recognition that over the past, say, 5 years, 6 years, the benefit generosity of MA plans has grown dramatically. And so there's a question about whether that is sustainable. And a belief that if you were to make modest, and I'll put 2% in the modest category, modest cuts, how much of those benefits would really be lost? I think some clearly would. I don't think it is true that one can say if you cut payments, we would lose nothing. But I think there's evidence that suggests what we lose would be modest, only relative to where we were in, say, 2019. And I think there's another concern broadly with Medicare Advantage plans that fits into this, which according to many criteria, the plans are just by and large very profitable. I'm not one that finds profits problematic as a reasonably free market economist. I think it's okay for organizations that are more efficient to make profits. But I think in this particular case, I think there's room to have some cuts without having substantial deleterious consequences. Understand that if money was no object, it would be much better to just pay more in Medicare, traditional Medicare. So the motivation, of course, at some level is clearly a fiscal one. The question in the end of the day is how much is lost relative to how much is gained. So that's what I think the MedPAC argument loosely is.
By the same token, wearing your Harvard economist and perhaps political observer hat, notwithstanding this MedPAC recommendation for cuts, you don't actually think cuts are going to take place. Why is that?
Yeah, so there's many people that could talk to you about what's going to happen, and I'm probably low on the list of that, so I won't claim to know. I think the reason that cuts are unlikely, personally, it's just purely Michael view, is that it is true that the added payments in Medicare Advantage have supported a lot of benefits going to Medicare beneficiaries, and a lot of those beneficiaries in Medicare Advantage are come from disadvantaged backgrounds, and I think there is wide support for both the continuation of private plans in Medicare. I actually think that's a reasonable view, and I think there's continued support for these added benefits going to Medicare beneficiaries. And so I think, again, I don't know, but at the end of the day, I think the fiscal pressures that would motivate any cuts run aground when they confront the risk of beneficiaries losing some of the benefits that they have now become accustomed. So this is admittedly a political debate, political discussion. It is not a crazy view that we should use the Medicare Advantage program to promote greater benefits to Medicare beneficiaries. The question is, can we accomplish those same goals with less spending? So again, I won't read what's going to happen. I think that the way that things are playing out, you won't see broad cuts, at least coming from Congress. What CMS might do, so it is on the table, I believe, and again, I have no inside information, it is on the table that CMS could change the coding and intensity factors, for example, or other types of program parameters. They could change the risk adjustment rules and caps. There are other sort of less visible tweaks to the Medicare Advantage program that may result in some cuts to Medicare Advantage, the Medicare Advantage program. I just don't think you're going to see broad congressional action. And again, speaking in my capacity as a Harvard professor, I do think there is room for some modest Medicare Advantage cuts with relatively small reductions in benefit generosity.
And in fact, you've actually said in the past that what it turns out that Medicare Advantage has done is it's actually been a way to channel more benefits to Medicare beneficiaries without having to make those legislatively. Is that fair?
Yes, I think what has happened is there's a view, which again, I think is a reasonable view. Actually, I should say the following, what I'm about to say is true. The Medicare benefit package is very incomplete. Right? And the reason why Medicare works is because most people, 90% or so, find some way or other to fill in the holes in Medicare. So that includes Medigap policies that some people buy individually. Sometimes they get it through their employer. Some people are on Medicare and Medicaid both, the duals, they get some of that filled in. And Medicare Advantage is another way of doing that. So I believe that the sort of I'm speaking kind of loosely here, the Build Back Better notion of we need to improve the Medicare benefit package, which I think faced challenges on the Hill, has been able to be furthered through aspects of the Medicare Advantage program somewhat indirectly, whereas the Medicare overall is not more generous. The Medicare Advantage plans provide a way for individual beneficiaries, particularly disadvantaged ones, to access a much more generous benefit package than they would get if they were left on their own and forced to purchase Medigap plans. And that, again, those extra benefits are financed in part through Medicare Advantage efficiencies, and they have to agree to a narrower network and some other utilization constraints, but it's also funded through explicit policy decisions regarding benchmarks and quality bonuses.
You brought up Build Back Better. Let's just talk briefly about what ended up taking its place, which was the Inflation Reduction Act, with a lot of changes now in prescription drug spending under Part D, and a projected future of more, in effect, efforts to rein in prescription drug prices and prescription drug spending. I know you don't necessarily want to get deep in those weeds because that remains future work for MedPAC to do. But as we stand and look at this set of policies today, what impact do you think that is going to have on Medicare spending?
So I think two things. First, let me make a big point, which is almost thematic for this session. When healthcare spending rises rapidly, either commercial or public, you see a series of responses, either in the commercial sector or policy responses. And so when those policy responses happen, like the Inflation Reduction Act, there is no sense in which you're necessarily going to get the absolute perfect policy. So if spending continues to rise at the rate with which it has risen, you will see some policy response. And there's no guarantee that that policy response will be what you think would be the ideal policy response. In the case of the Inflation Reduction Act, and specifically with regards to drugs, this is a particularly challenging area because while there's innovation across the healthcare space, I think the innovation in the prescription drug space is sort of qualitatively greater. And so the tension you have when you're paying for drugs really is how are you balancing what we pay at any point in time with the incentives to innovate. And the problem in the the drug space overall is because drugs are patented and then they're put in a third-party payment system with coverage, there's a tendency for the prices to be very, very, very high. As a result, both policymakers and commercial stakeholders respond with, say, restricted formularies or other types of responses. And there's an enormous amount of underlying administrative complexity in that world. So we have PBMs, pharmacy benefit management companies. We have copay cards, copay accumulator cards. We have a whole slew of other things that happen in what is, I think, broadly understood as a very dysfunctional space writ large. The Inflation Reduction Act is a response to all of that, and its impact will depend on two things, neither of which are particularly well known, at least not well known to me, but hopefully someone will tell me, they'll email me, here's what you should have said. So one is what happens to the price of specific drugs. So there's a negotiation process. It occurs on a relatively small number of drugs, relatively in the future. We can debate the magnitudes of that. You hear some people say it's not going to have a big effect at all. Some people say the negotiations will be quite strong. They all have various reasons why they believe this. I don't think we know exactly how the negotiation process is going to play out and what's really going to happen. So there's one point, which is how strong will the negotiation process play out? What will happen to the drugs? And that's going to be important for the fiscal consequences of the rule. What I think is actually probably a bigger and lesser known impact in the long run is going to be what the Inflation Reduction Act does to innovation. What I think the evidence economics evidence, and not from me, so my read of the economics evidence here is that there's a modest agreement that if you change the financial incentives to create new drugs, there will be fewer new drugs. CBO is an assumption that reflects that. Other people think the assumption should be bigger. Other people think it should be less. But there's some acknowledgement that there's a relationship between the financial reward to developing a drug and the actual number of new drugs that are developed. What is less clear is whether the changes to the innovative drugs in the innovation will be a reduction in really important foregone blockbuster drugs that would have been crucial to improve the health of Americans, or will there be a reduction in relatively clinically unimportant drugs that were being priced more than their value and taking advantage of sort of other aspects of pricing in the system in a whole range of ways. And so I just don't think we have a really good sense yet of either how much or maybe more importantly, what type of innovation will be lost. And I think in the long run, the fiscal consequences of the Inflation Reduction Act are probably going to be a greater reflection of its impact on innovation, which will depend on how it's implemented in a bunch of things, than it will be on the price of any specific drug at a particular point in time.
Great. And I'm gathering it will be in part on MedPAC's agenda to try to figure out how to factor all of this into its projections and then specifically policy recommendations.
MedPAC will have a June chapter on Part B drugs and related things about how to deal with these issues. And while I think that's a great body of work, it will certainly not be the last word in how to deal with some of this, in part because it's going to be a broad view, and a lot of what's going to happen here is going to be on the actual details of implementation that are happening and being worked out at CMS right now.
Great. Well, we will all stay tuned. Let's switch over to physician fees. As we saw, there is a core of our audience today who are physicians and who will be well aware of the fact that there is a confluence of factors right now that threatens a rather substantial cut in Medicare physician fees as of next year. And of course, a lot of action right now, or I should say discussion in Congress. We'll see if it leads to action in the lame duck session to try to avert some of those fee cuts. From your perspective, and you have made the point also in the context of saying that reimbursement pressures will continue, pressures on physician fees will continue. What is your outlook at this point for physician fees in Medicare in the near term?
So the history, which I think you know well, is we had a system of Medicare physician payment that was called the Sustainable Growth Rate System, which was many things that was not sustainable. It was replaced with the macro legislation. Sometimes people refer to it of MIPS because MIPS was part of the macro legislation. But really, the key issue here is not the MIPS part of it. The key issue here is the underlying baseline increase. And the rule in macro for baseline increase is basically flat payment increases. It's flat for a few years, and then it goes up 20.25, 0.75, depending on your participation in APMs. But under any scenario, physician fees are rising less than inflation, and that's problematic in general. It's particularly problematic when inflation is very rapid. So I think there's a lot of pressure to pay physicians more, and I won't speak to what's going to happen, but MedPAC will be reporting in March, and if you go to the December and January MedPAC meetings, you will hear a detailed discussion of our recommendations on this point. But my general sense is long run, this is now a Michael point, long run there is a challenge to have flat nominal physician fees, and there will need to be some discussion of that. Short run, I think there's a few things that are going on. One of them is that during the public health emergency, the sequester was suspended. Now, as that has ended, the sequester has been reimposed. That reimposition is viewed as a cut, which it, in some sense, is relative to not having the sequester, but it's certainly not a cut relative to where you were in 2019. You're just getting back to the baseline of where you were in 2019. And so while it's a cut, I think it's a little disingenuous to say they're cutting fees. They're really returning them to the trajectory that they were supposed to be on prior to the public health emergency. The other thing, which is even, I think, a little more nuanced, is that there was a physician payment rule that's called the E&M rule, Evaluation and Management Rule, that reweighted the payments for evaluation and management services. The goal was to reward non-procedural type services, say office visits, more than they had been. And some of the increases in fees associated with that rule were actually quite large, 20% for certain E&M codes, for example. When that rule was implemented, originally the hope, or maybe not the hope, the design would have been that it would have been budget neutral. So to offset the cost of paying more for E&M services, there was a cut in the conversion factor. That cut in the conversion factor was essentially spread out over multiple years. And so what's impending is the second part, if you will, of that E&M rule cut, which is again intended to impose a budget neutrality on a bigger change. But if you're a person that does a lot of procedures, you will perceive that just as a cut. Essentially what the rule originally intended to do was to pay for E&M services more and to pay for non-E&M services less, broadly speaking. And so essentially all the payment increases in E&M, and by the way, that's not just for primary care. There's a lot of non-primary care physicians that provide E&M services. But in any case, that E&M payment increase happened in 2021, and now we're talking about continuing to pay for it through 2023, but that's the part of the cut that people are worried about. What I think will happen, so first of all, I think there's going to be a lot of pressure, and this is again Michael speaking, an acknowledgement that a flat nominal physician fee schedule is just a huge challenge. And I think there will be some pressure to revisit this MACRA deal. I don't know what timeline that will be on, and I don't know what form that will take. It is an area of great interest. And I think there will be some pressure in the lame duck Congress to forestall these, I'll call them cuts per your word, but these sort of policy payment changes that are really the shadow of past payment changes. The past payment changes were more generous to providers, and so these new payment changes are less. They're cuts relative to the greater generosity, but it's really trying to put the system back on a trajectory that was on prior to the pandemic. One could debate, I think, legitimately whether that trajectory was reasonable, but that's what's sort of going on now. I think there will be some efforts on the Hill to slow that down, offset that, delay that, put more money into the physician payment system. I think my personal view is that the physician payment system writ large is going to require some attention beyond just those few cuts. I think there's a lot of other things happening in physician payments and in the fee-for-service system more generally, telehealth, for example, a bunch of things related to that, that require a lot more thought and payment that transcends just, okay, we're going to give you an extra 3% because we had a lot of inflation.
So. You've made the point in the past that this entire regime of Medicare physician payment is, I'll put this in my words, screwed up 60 different ways to Sunday. And that, number one. And number two, you just said a few moments ago that you think this notion of flat to declining payment in real terms for physicians is not sustainable over the long run and is not going to produce good outcomes. So where do we go from here in your view?
Yeah, so there's a few things that I think are important. The first one, and again, you'll see this in the MedPAC work, there's a real attention in MedPAC for both physicians, for that matter, hospitals, on supporting what we call, broadly speaking, the safety net. But one of the challenges with the payment systems is there's a single conversion factor, and it is challenging to get that right, because while some organizations are doing quite well, others not as much. And so if you were to pay enough so that the most challenged organizations did well, you would be probably paying too much for the organizations that were doing well anyway. And so the safety net attention in both the physician space and in the hospital space, a part of it has been to think about a little more flexibility in payment to deal with safety nets to support providers that really need to be supported as opposed to across-the-board increases. That's one issue. I think there's another challenge that continues to be true, although I think we need to wait to see how the E&M rule plays out, which is the balance between specialists and primary care physicians. A lot of times we debate 1% more, 1% less. The challenge is in getting, for example, more primary care physicians, more people to be primary care physicians, is not going to be solved with a percent or two and the primary care physician fee. There's a lot of burdens associated with being a primary care physician. There's a lot of other issues associated with what it means to have that type of practice. And I think we need to think through those types of issues and how we balance that. There's a lot of other challenges related to the fact that increasingly physicians are employed by larger organizations. So the narrative we have is often about an independent physician practice. Often we have in our mind a small physician practice. And again, there are a lot of small physician practices, but a growing number of physicians are now practicing it for large organizations. And when we talk about changes to physician payments, a lot of that money is actually going to the organizations that those physicians work for. And so there's a lot of attention. There's been a lot of historic MedPAC attention on site neutral payments. So to give you an example of something that's problematic, I think you said 60. I won't go for 60, but for a service delivered in a hospital outpatient department, there's a facility payment fee and a physician fee. The facility payment fee largely captures a lot of the practice expenses. If that same service is delivered in a physician office, there is a portion of the physician fee that goes into the practice expense RVU. That's more than you would get. That gets shrunk when it moves to the HOPD. But the combined payment is not equal for the same service between the HOPD and the physician outpatient department. So that's what is often called at MedPAC and other places site neutral payments, trying to harmonize that. But more broadly, the update factors are different. So the update factor for the hospital outpatient department, the facility side, that gets updated with the OPPS, or the outpatient prospective payment system rate. And the physician expense portion, in this time of a lot of inflation, gets updated at the physician fee rate, which right now under current law is flat. So there's an asymmetry of how we pay for parts of the expenses. If it's done in a facility, you're getting paid on one system. If you're done in an office, you get paid through another system. And that lack of coordination, that lack of acknowledgement of the different settings that organizations are, where care is being delivered, I think becomes problematic, and that we have created these siloed fee schedules, failing to acknowledge the tremendous integration across the system that's occurring. So I think there's a lot of work as we go through and think about fee schedule changes on the physician side, not just changing the rates for fee schedules, but how we really think about the practice expense side relative to the physician work side and a slew of other things related to that. And I'll stop after this one. Is what has really held the primary care physician market together has been the growth of primary care delivered by advanced practice nurses, who by and large also many practice not in primary care, but for primary care, particularly in some areas of the country, rural areas, you see really this shift of care delivery away from primary care physicians towards advanced practice nurses, who in many cases provide outstanding care. But the challenge is how we think about that. So while the number of physicians that are specialists has continued to grow, the number of physicians that are primary care physicians has actually shrunk, and being filled in with care from other types of healthcare professionals. And I think that while the fee schedule contributes to that disparity, it's not the only reason we have that disparity. And at the beginning, we mentioned a lot of workforce issues, and that spans physician and non-physician workforce and a bunch of things in hospitals. I think we really need to think about our fee schedules and our payment models in that light, because there's a lot that can be done there to help manage how those services are paid.
Great. So we have several more polling questions to take up. So I want to briefly turn this over to Brian to take a few of those. And then I think we'll try to take some audience questions as well. Brian, do you want to step in with the polling issues?
Great. Thanks, Susan. Yes. Let's get to our second round of polling questions here. And the first one, which is our fourth polling question, is what just best describes your organization's perception of its future commercial payments? A, will continue to rely on high commercial payments to fill the gap left by low public program payment. Commercial payment is also being squeezed and won't be enough to offset low public program payment. Not sure. Or D, not applicable to my organization. So again, select the radio button on the left. That represents your best answer, and make sure that you hit the submit button at the bottom of the slide. And again, if you can't see that submit button on your slide, make sure you expand the slide, and it should show up near the bottom. And we're approaching 75% participation here. So let's get the remaining 20% in. And we'll give a few more moments to make sure we capture the most CPE credit that we can before we take a look at our results. Again, kind of covering the spectrum of answers here, with commercial payment continuing to be squeezed and not expecting that cost shift to be there going forward. in the future. Interesting, certainly relevant to our discussion here today. Our fifth polling question: what best describes your organization's state of readiness for continued low or shrinking public program payment? We're ready. We're preparing. We've been preparing for this for a long time. We think we're ready. We've been partnering with providers and payers to strategize on evolving reimbursement models and changing payer mix. We will have to make major changes in structure and operations. We are not likely to survive or not sure. And just a reminder for those that are out there, you do need to submit answers to 5 of the 6 polling questions to get your treasured CPE credit. You want to make sure you get that, so please respond to the polling questions. We have just one more after this, and then we'll get back to our discussion with Susan and Michael. And as Susan mentioned, we are monitoring the audience Q&A, so I think we'll have a chance to take a look at some of those. Lots of not sures on this one. It's difficult for healthcare organizations to create a state of readiness for a shrinking reimbursement environment, we understand. And finally, in 2023, will your organization place an emphasis on shifting to value-based care payment arrangements? And you can see the choice of answers here. We've already made a shift to risk-based payment arrangements. B, yes, we have some risk payment arrangements and will continue to expand this form of reimbursement in 2023. C, not yet, but it's one of our top priorities. D, no, we are not planning on entering any new value-based care payment arrangements in 2023. I don't know, or not applicable. We'll have some announcements at the end when we turn it back over to Amy about how to access your CPE certificate at the end of our presentation. So make sure you stay tuned for that. I want to make sure you get access to that. And again, select the best answer for your organization and hit submit. And we'll give the audience just a few more moments. We're at 79% people. Let's get over the 80% mark. There we go. We appreciate everybody's attention, and Susan, that completes our audience polling activities. We are CPE certified, so I think we're in a great position to finish up our discussion with Michael and perhaps get to some audience Q&A.
Great. Thank you, Brian. And as you said, it's interesting as we've gone through these polling questions, there are no clear winners here. A lot of different approaches by a lot of different organizations, a lot of different experiences by many different organizations in various sectors of healthcare. So let's take up a couple of the audience questions that have come in. And Michael, some of these bear on some of the features that we've seen as care begins to move out of traditional institutional settings and goes more into homes, communities, et cetera, representing some different payment challenges than in the past. One question has come up with respect to remote patient monitoring. And one of our questioners asks, RPM obviously is gradually being adopted by healthcare organizations. Payment rules, reimbursement rules are beginning to change for these services, but not for the most fragile cohort, FQHCs. Is that an issue, number one, on MedPAC's agenda? And if so, why isn't reimbursement changing for FQHCs?
That is not an issue that is on MedPAC's reimbursement agenda now, particularly for FQHCs. The issue of payment models for remote patient monitoring is really a subset of the issue of payment models for telehealth type services, a bunch of digital health services. And that is very much on the MedPAC agenda. It's, I can speak a little more if you'd like, Susan, about where I think we're going to go or what the issues are, but you have to guide me.
Let's do that. Let's talk more generally about that, because obviously right now in particular, it looks like the nation is obviously going to extend the public health emergency beyond January, but we don't know how much farther beyond January. And so a lot of the payment and other flexibilities in telehealth could well go away. What, from the MedPAC perspective, seems most likely or even desirable at this point?
The MedPAC perspective, which actually in this case is pretty close to mine, is sort of, these are important services. They provide value, remote patient monitoring and otherwise. We should not stop them in their tracks. That said, there are a lot of challenges with just blanket permissiveness in how these services are used. And so MedPAC has taken what I would say a cautiously positive view. Continue doing some subsets. Again, it matters from what the type of service is. It's all about how you figure out the rules to have them used effectively. And the challenge here, and I'll use remote patient monitoring as an example, but I'll give you a number of others. These are services that really do not fit well into a fee-for-service paradigm. The unit of service is challenging. There's a lot of other services that might come along with remote patient monitoring that might be helpful, but in a fee-for-service world, it's very hard to know when the use is appropriate. There's been a dramatic rise in the use of remote patient monitoring. That is not a bad thing, although understanding if the use at the margin is really necessary is important. My understanding is that increase in remote patient monitoring, for example, is very concentrated in some facilities that are doing that. So there's a lot more to be learned, and I think the MedPAC view is before we have permanent ways of dealing with this, we should learn more. But again, I think ultimately we're going to find that a whole range of services, hospital at home, remote patient monitoring, a whole range of digital health services, a lot of e-consults that are happening, asynchronous consults that people are going to want to get paid for. There's new codes for algorithms, so people are getting paid for AI algorithms for interpreting tests. I think there's a sort of paradigm of the American healthcare system that when you can do something differently with some new technology, we need a new code. And that, I think, is what happens when you have those new codes is an enormous amount of administrative burden to understand how it plays out. In the case of remote care, there's questions about how you would deal with cost sharing for individuals. For example, it's hard to collect. You might be sending bills for very small units. It really becomes quite challenging. I think that all of these new technologies make the case for new, broader payment models that don't require the administrative burden of understanding exactly when should a physician be paid for responding to their emails. So one of the challenges that I think, I talked before about primary care physicians and payment. I think one of the challenges now with primary care, I think this is true of medicine writ large, but I'm going to focus on primary care, is there's so many new modes of communication that a lot of the primary care physicians I know, after they finish their full day of practicing medicine, have to then go catch up on all of their emails. And because the burden of sending an email is much lower, there's just a lot more of them. Many of the larger practices, of course, have varying ways of triaging those emails. So you're getting answered not by your physician, by a nurse practitioner or somebody, which in many cases is fine, and that gets triaged if needed to the physician. But we're still struggling with those types of models and understanding what the bounds of a visit is in a remote world. And I just think we're going to find at the end of the day that if we try and address that problem with a basic fee-for-service way of thinking, we will inevitably fail. And in part because it's hard to know what the right price is, in part because we will drive everybody crazy with the criteria for how many, does this qualify for this level visit, that level visit? How are we going to document what we did and all of those things? I think that's becomes much harder overall. So I think a model that relies less on fee for service and more on say, partial capitation or other types of things that other organizations can put in place, might be much more supportive of these new modalities than I think trying to figure out how many new fees we can put in the fee-for-service system. So just back to your FQHC question, FQHCs are very important. They're actually paid through a different system. They're actually updated by inflation. There's a separate FQHC inflation adjustment. But I think that's a subset of a different question of how do we support vulnerable safety net providers that serve a lot of low income or Medicare patients, and those aren't necessarily synonymous. And I think we will have to do a lot of policy in that space in general. In the Medicare side, we have a safety net version, but FQHCs are much broader than that. And then there's a separate issue. FQHCs are urban and rural. There's a whole separate issue, which might be a whole other hour of discussion of how do we make sure we can provide access to important care for people in rural areas, which is changing dramatically in ways that requires, I think, a lot of policy attention.
Great. Thanks. Well, moving on to a somewhat different question, another of our audience members asks, and this is with respect to value-based payment models. How do small health systems in rural areas succeed in value-based care capitation when they really cannot afford to take on the associated risk? Does this mean that only large enterprises will succeed? And I guess we should interject here that CMS and CMMI have now instituted or will be instituting in 2023 some advanced incentive payment models that actually channel money ahead of time to smaller practices, especially those in rural areas, to give them a little bit more wherewithal to undertake the kinds of changes that are necessary to deliver care and value-based models. Not necessarily enough money at this point to accept a lot of risk, but at least to begin to make the journey along the way. I guess a question for you is that an appropriate policy response? The answer would seem to be yes, but I'll put the question to you. And what more needs to be done to incentivize more rural areas of the country to make bigger entries into value-based care?
So a few things. I don't believe that every part of the country needs to be in a value-based care arrangement for a range of reasons. So I do think we need to make sure we have a payment model that supports organizations in those areas, and they need not be a broad value-based ACO type model. I think there are real issues with scale in certain types of models like that, although in some cases they can be pooled with other organizations, so you can have conveners that pool organizations in a range of ways that allow them to participate in that way. I do think the CMS response is appropriate, but I will add that there's another challenge which blends two topics you've asked me, which is as Medicare Advantage grows, what you see is shrinking volumes in the fee-for-service sides that are paid this way. So in the extreme, if Medicare Advantage keeps growing, it will crowd out this sort of value-based payment transformation because the organizations will simply not have enough payments in the models to make true care transformation worthwhile. So now again, they could get those different types of payments through the MA plans, but the sort of CMS models become challenged with Medicare Advantage growth. The last thing I'll say in response to your question is, I am of the belief, this is a personal comment, I am of the belief that organizations can be successful in one side only, upside only value-based payment models. I don't think we need to impose risk. I do think we need to think about how benchmarks are set in that context. One of the biggest challenges with the value-based payment models so far, in my opinion, has been your past success will lead to future failure because the better you do, the lower you set your benchmark in the future. And I think long run, that's just a formula for failure in the value-based payment model. We, myself, my colleagues, have been advocating something called an administrative benchmark, where you set a benchmark, you know there's going to be what the benchmark is going to be, you know where it's going to be in advance. If you're efficient, you get to share a large share of the gains, and you don't have to worry that that's going to be taken away from you through some sort of rebasing process. And that won't, and I think if you set that correctly, there is room for organizations and upside-only models to succeed relative to where the benchmark trajectory was set, to the extent that they can bring in efficiencies out of the system. But it is not clear to me that in rural areas we have a ton of inefficiency, that there's too much care, we want to reduce the amount of care. I think you can make a case that there's not enough care in places in rural America. And I don't think we need to force providers in those settings into these one-size-fit-all models. I do think that there, as I said before, I do think there's opportunities for it to work through conveners, things like that. So I think it can work. I think CMS responses are valuable, but I don't think this is simply going to be a world in which everyone needs to be in their own ACO. That's just not going to be feasible and probably not desirable.
But from what you're saying, it sounds like you could set administrative benchmarks in rural areas at rates that would be attractive enough for providers to be in upside-only risk arrangements and still accomplish all the good that ACOs could do in terms of coordination of care, et cetera. Is that fair?
I believe that is true. I don't know the evidence. One of the challenges in rural areas, or actually for any small provider, is there's just very widespread swings in pay, right? And so how you deal, again, upside-only risk helps you, but how you deal with that variability over time and how you deal with the attribution and how you deal with a number of other things is challenging. So I do believe you could set benchmarks that work, but I also believe you need scale that may actually be challenging for many organizations in smaller markets. And so I think it is feasible to design better models, and I think CMMI will do that for upfront payments, risk management things, but I think there's much more that's going to have to go on in those places.
Okay.
And I do think administrative benchmarks would help.
We'll take one more question here, and then we'll move to wrap up. A questioner asks, do you have any data related to national Medicare Advantage plans, quote, short paying, unquote, hospital providers?
I'm not sure I know what short paying is, so I'm going to go with no. But I suspect even if I did understand what short paying was, I would still think the answer is no. The evidence and the data are between what happens from the Medicare Advantage plan and the providers that they contract with is not nearly as transparent as what's happening in the fee-for-service system. And I might add broadly, one of the challenging data issues is that a lot of money is flowing, not a lot, an increasing amount of money is flowing outside of the claim system. So even if you have an encounter database, for example, we don't know what's happened contractually between the plans and the providers. And so our system of understanding what's happening between MA plans and providers is challenging. There are always provider complaints about how they're treated by MA plans. I don't have any specific ability to assess the magnitude of that or how widespread it is.
Okay. Well, we'll have to look into more about what short paying actually means. So with that, Mike, if I had to sum up what we've been talking about, we started off talking about what is driving growth in Medicare in particular. And as you said, it's essentially demographics and volume intensity. It is not pricing. Whereas on the commercial side, we still see a lot of the drive of growth coming in pricing. But as you said, that is in all likelihood going to moderate over in coming years. So overall reimbursement pressures on the system are going to remain fairly pronounced. That was a fundamental point you left us all with. With respect to Medicare Advantage, there are reasons to think about reducing some of the overpayments that have been driven by policy considerations in MA plans, but also really for enabling the whole system to benefit from the efficiencies inherent in Medicare Advantage by virtue of payment cuts. But as you mentioned, from a political standpoint, Congress may not choose to go that way, even if CMS does make some changes administratively that lower payments overall to the system. We talked a bit about, just a moment ago, about some of these newer modalities of care provision, remote patient monitoring, telehealth, et cetera, and the fact that trying to wedge those into fee-for-service might not make the most sense. That there really is a case for value-based payment models taking these up in order to use all of these things very appropriately. With all of that said, I think the bottom line is we're going to expect and need a lot of change in healthcare delivery going forward. And predominantly, the more that moves in the direction of value-based payment, and that would include, I gather, payment for physicians as well. The more that happens, we'll have the best possible shot of getting the greatest efficiency and the best care delivered out of the massive amount of spending that we're going to allot in this country to healthcare. Is that a pretty fair wrap-up of what we've just talked about, or how would you alter that in any way?
I'm not going to alter that at all. I'm going to say yes. Hopefully for the people that are like seeing this on video, they can just scroll through to your wrap-up and save themselves some time. But I think that's basically spot on. We need to make changes. They're clearly going to be challenging, and there's not going to be sort of a one-size-fits-all solution.
Great. Well, with that, Mike, thanks so much. It was a great pleasure talking with you, and let me turn things back over to Brian to close us out today.
Thank you, Susan. And I second that emotion, Michael. Thank you so much for your remarks today, for our audience on a topic that's always top of the hot topics lists when we do our outreach. So appreciate that. And thanks again to the audience for your engagement and participation. I will really quickly, before I turn it over to Amy, encourage you to join us Thursday as we finish up virtually our 2022 healthcare conference with our final session, Politics in the Pandemic. Paul Keckley, managing editor of the Keckley Report. Should be an interesting and entertaining discussion here about the political activities going on in the fall, including important Senate runoff race today in Georgia, and how those activities and outcomes might impact health policy going forward. So with that, I'll turn it to Amy to close out our session today.
All right. Thank you, Brian. And thank you, Susan and Michael, for a really great discussion today. And to our attendees, if you met all CPE requirements, your certificate is available to download now in the CPE progress window. A copy will be emailed within 2 weeks should you have difficulty downloading it now. And as a reminder, if you attended today's presentation in a group and would like to receive CPE credit, you must complete the group attendance sheet found in your console. And finally, here's a link to an online survey for today's presentation. And thank you for joining us. We hope you'll join us again on Thursday. And take care, everyone.